Not long ago, the question of whether the Mafia existed at all was a valid topic of debate. Many people, including FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, for years denied the very existence of organized crime. And for years, the country's top racketeers were able to elude the justice system. With the exception of post-communist Russia, the U.S. has long led the world with the most pervasive organized criminal presence anywhere. And while the mob flourished under Hoover's hands-off policy, recent decades have seen significant inroads by law enforcement. Some say the Mafia has now come full circle, returning to its roots as a loose association of disparate street gangs. None illustrates this reversal of fortune better than the Lucchese crime family of New York. Named after the second boss of the family, this organized crime dynasty traces its origins back to the streets of New York City early in the 20th century. New York was a port of entry for most of America's European immigrants. It became the breeding ground for some of organized crime's most notorious members. Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, all came from immigrant families who settled in the Five Points area, a crowded ghetto with a long history of Irish, Jewish, and Italian gang activity. It was here that a diverse bunch of these ethnic gangs coalesced in the early 1930s. 5 large criminal groups, or families, emerged as a central core of a vast nationwide crime syndicate we generally refer to as the mob. The top gangsters of the Prohibition era also formed a commission consisting of the heads of the 5 families and a few others, and it is here in New York where the commission members still meet in secret, still discuss business, still order hits, and still control the rackets that have made these Mafia bosses filthy rich. The term crime family refers to the distinct Mafia organizations numbering anywhere from just over 100 to several hundred official members. They have a specific hierarchy, with a boss at the top and soldiers at the bottom. And surprisingly, most members are not actually related to each other. The 5 New York families, Gambino, Genovese, Bonanno, Colombo, and Lucchese, are all named after powerful bosses who at one time ruled these organizations. None of those bosses, however, were founders of the criminal enterprises, and to most outsiders, their existence would not be known until well into the 20th century.
Are you a member of any secret organization?
Yes, I am.
What is the name of it?
Cosa Nostra in Italian.
Cosa Nostra in Italian.
Our thing and our family in English.
In 1963, Joseph Valachi became one of the first members of the Mafia to break Omertà, the code of silence, and to reveal the secret rituals and inner workings of the mob. For the first time, the public learned of the 5 Cosa Nostra families and the unique hierarchy of these organizations. At the top is the boss, his underboss, and consigliere, the Mafia equivalent of president, vice president, and attorney general. Next, the family has a number of capos, who each had a crew made up of soldiers, lowest-ranking made members, who along with non-made associates usually work at the street level. The name at the top of one of those family charts was Gaetano Lucchese, who had long ago Americanized his first name to Tommy. From then on, his became known as the Lucchese crime family. The gangster organization that would later bear his name was already evolving when young Gaetano Lucchese first arrived in America with his parents in 1905. The Luccheses, who had come from Palermo, Sicily, were among hundreds of thousands of immigrants who came to this country in search of a better life. Instead of streets paved with gold, however, many found themselves on the fringes of society, performing back-breaking work for meager wages.
What they saw of America was that their fathers, if they were lucky, could get a construction job and work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and die early for 5 cents an hour.
Author Ernest Volkman, who has chronicled the family in a recent book, says Tommy Lucchese's hard-working father and religious mother tried to steer him in the right direction.
The Lucchese family, like all the other Italian immigrant families, they were determined that their sons and daughters would make it in the new world. And they would very often say to their sons, I don't want you to be a donkey like me. I want to see you study, you do your homework, you go to school. I don't want to hear there's any problems in school. I don't want to hear that you're a truant. I want you to get an education, and I want you to do better than me.
Early on, though, Lucchese felt the lure of the streets.
Every block in an Italian neighborhood had a social club. And when they walked past the social club, they saw something very different. Guys in suits, beautiful suits, fedoras, Italian handmade shoes, big beautiful cars, women. Kids like Lucchese, they wanted to hang around. Because what did they see? They saw the American dream, money, power. Nobody bothered these guys.
When Tommy Lucchese was a teenager, his father disowned the son he was unable to save from the streets.
Lucchese came from a family where he was the only criminal. All the rest of the people in his family were quite straight, ordinary, and for the rest of their days were very sensitive and very ashamed over the fact that they were even related to this guy.
Tommy became roommates with a boyhood friend, Salvatore Lucania, who would later be known as Charles Lucky Luciano, credited as the founder of the syndicate.
His arrest record started when he was 10 years old. He moved out of the neighborhood and he settled in East Harlem and changed his name to Luciano, so as not to shame his family any further.
Along with Lucky Luciano, Tommy Lucchese's rise in the underworld came quickly. He developed a reputation as being a stone-cold killer. By the end of World War I, he was working as Luciano's bodyguard and favored hitman. Carl Sefakis researched Tommy Lucchese for the Mafia Encyclopedia.
By that time, he was already active with Luciano and the others and Albert Anastasia. Now, Albert Anastasia was considered the worst killer of them all. He was the Lord High Executioner, Murder Incorporated. Luciano, I always thought Lucchese was a better killer than him. He could trust him more. He was cool. He followed orders.
Really, the modern American Mafia, as we know it, was born up on those streets in the boyhood rumbles of guys like Luciano, Lucchese, and Frank Costello, and Vito Genovese. They all knew each other, and they were all in the same, what was called a Borgata. Borgata means like a gang of delinquent boys. East Harlem was a really tough immigrant neighborhood. I mean, it was poor, it was violent, it was squalid, it was crowded. But it also produced Fiorello LaGuardia. And it produced judges. And it produced distinguished businessmen. Why, in an immigrant neighborhood, why do some go into the Borgata and some go to college? We don't know.
Lucchese went in a direction quite different than the one his parents imagined for him. His association with Luciano and other hoodlums led him directly into the Mafia, which would be a part of his life from then on. Lucchese, Luciano, and many of their friends eventually became members of the large gang run by Joe the Boss Masseria, a Sicilian who operated out of the Italian neighborhood of East Harlem. Bootlegging was their main source of illegal profit, made possible by the national ban on the sale of alcohol. While supporters of Prohibition had hoped it would cure America's social problems, in reality, it provided gangsters with the opportunity of a lifetime. Lucky Luciano and his criminal associates worked out an elaborate system to import and distribute alcohol all over the United States. Meyer Lansky masterminded the finances. Tommy Lucchese organized the transportation system. Frank Costello handled the bribery of law enforcement and politicians.
These were guys who were innovative thinkers. They were smart, they were shrewd, they were not educated in the academic sense, but they understood business. They understood markets. They had all the requisite talents to become great businessmen. But for reasons that we don't quite yet understand, they went in another direction.
By the mid-30s, the business of bootlegging had become highly competitive and dangerous, with violent turf wars breaking out all over America. In New York, Joe the Boss found his supremacy threatened by a new Sicilian arrival, the power-hungry Salvatore Maranzano.
Maranzano came over and he tried to purify the mob that would be all coming from one part of Sicily, and they would knock off everybody else and control everything.
Maranzano trusted only Sicilians from the same hometown as his, Castellammare del Golfo, and the feud between Masseria and Maranzano became known as the Castellammarese War. As the war escalated, the younger Americanized Italians and their Jewish gangster partners plotted to rid themselves of what they called the old mustache Petes, whose rivalry they viewed as an obstacle to true wealth.
Mario Lansky summed it up best. He said, look, Chevrolet salesmen don't shoot Ford salesmen, do they? He made his point. Why are you shooting each other? There's plenty for everybody.
An ambitious and cunning Lucky Luciano pretended to defect to the Maranzano camp. He then lured his old boss, Masseria, to a Coney Island restaurant where Masseria was executed, reportedly by Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, Alfred Anastasia, and Bugsy Siegel. Maranzano claimed victory and called a meeting of all the Italian gangsters, proclaiming himself boss of bosses. He then divided up the business amongst those most loyal to him. This was the beginning of the Mafia crime families as we know them today.
Maranzano formed 5 specific organizations, okay, and he set them up along the lines of a Roman legion. He didn't call them families. They were set up just like Roman legions. And they were to control strictly the crime within their very specific organized territories.
But there were those who found fault with the new system.
Luciano and Genovese were under him, but they saw that he was opposed to working with the Jewish mobsters, and if you were in bootleg at the time, you had to be involved with the Jewish gangsters, like the Purple Gang that dominated bringing over liquor through Detroit.
Meanwhile, Maranzano knew he'd have to get rid of the fast-rising Luciano. But Luciano had sent over Tom Galliano and Tommy Lucchese as spies in the Maranzano camp.
Maranzano was no fool. He knew he had to get rid of Luciano and the whole bunch, and Costello and the others. He had it. So he was planning to kill them all. However, the 2 spies that he trusted very much was Gagliano and Lucchese.
Lucchese warned Luciano of the plot. The Luciano loyalists then counterplotted and sent Lucchese to Maranzano's office on the pretense of having urgent business to discuss. Within moments, 4 Jewish gangsters posing as treasury agents burst into the office and lined Maranzano's men up against the wall. Lucchese fingered the victim, and the assassins carried out the hit on Maranzano.
Lucchese ran out, and when the police came, there was nobody there except a dead man. And that cleared the way for the American Mafia to be established.
Great criminal vision, Luciano, together with his Jewish mobster partner Meyer Lansky, established a national syndicate of organized crime and a commission to act as governing body. In New York, the 5 families set up by Maranzano were reorganized, and Tom Galliano was given leadership of one of them, with Tommy Lucchese as his underboss. After Galliano died from natural causes, Lucchese took command and led the family to its most prosperous and peaceful era. Though his main occupation was mob boss, Lucchese kept a low profile and maintained a front in the garment business to camouflage his criminal activity. His loan-sharking enterprise gave him ownership in several legitimate businesses. He lent huge amounts of money to garment manufacturers, desperate to meet commitments to their buyers. When the owners couldn't repay the loan, Lucchese settled for a piece of the business. To the outside world, he was a very successful dressmaker.
He controlled one of the big dress companies there, and at the same time shook down all the others. They were taking like 30, 40 grand a year for you to stay in business.
The real money, of course, was in the rackets Lucchese had come to learn so well. Along with loan sharking, the Lucchese family ran another traditional big money maker, gambling. It was a time-honored business for gangsters, Italian, Jewish, or other.
But Bugsy Siegel would walk down the street, and what first attracted him was gambling. There were gambling games out on the street, crap games. People rolling dice up against a brick wall. And he'd look down and be piles of money laying around, people betting money.
They can set up dice rooms, and it may not sound like much, but when you have 6 dice rooms going 24 hours a day with high rollers, you're taking in thousands and thousands of dollars an hour.
The mob didn't always agree on business. One of the rackets that caused the greatest dissent was heroin dealing. Tommy Lucchese opposed drug trafficking as it left the family too exposed to scrutiny on the streets. Others, unable to ignore the enormous profits, embraced it. All took their share of the profits from the illegal trade.
Lucchese got his cut, you know. He kept away from it, but he expected his cut.
By the 1930s, the mob was looking for new industries to corrupt. Their most profitable enterprise, bootlegging, dried up with the repeal of Prohibition. Partnering again with Jewish gangsters, Lucchese found a new source of revenue in New York's multi-million-dollar kosher chicken industry. He gained control of one of the key unions, set prices, and made sure the mob got a piece of the profits. He repeated this highly successful formula in other industries.
At another point, they took control of a union which represented candy workers, people who manufacture candy. And as a result, the price of candy went up rather sharply. So millions of American children were paying a small Mafia tax every time they bought a little bar of candy.
When the mob was in a particular industry, they exerted the kind of influence or domination or control which meant that individual business owners within that industry really had very little choice on how they were to operate. And that was devastating for economic freedom, for costs, and for the way society ought to be run.
Full of unions and industry infiltration that became the Lucchese hallmark and made this crime family one of the richest and most successful. While organized criminal groups have always made money with such favors as gambling, prostitution, and extortion, it was mostly after Prohibition that the mob began looking for new rackets to exploit. Tommy Lucchese's outfit was particularly adept at coming up with lucrative new schemes to bring in piles of cash.
They were involved primarily in crimes such as murder, loan sharking, gambling, labor racketeering, obstruction of justice, political corruption. You name it, the Lucchese family was involved in every aspect of New York's economic system.
Lucchese learned that the secret to a successful industry racket is to seize control of a key union, then put the squeeze on the business owners. This tactic was especially effective in the garment and construction trades.
In the case of the garment center, organized crime, the Lucchese family specifically discovered that there is one key to trucking, that's Teamsters Union. There's one Teamsters Union local which represents virtually all the truck drivers in the garment center. Now, if you take control of that local, as they did, now you've got power. Why is it power? Because if the Teamsters Union suddenly goes on strike, nothing moves.
The same was true in construction. As an assistant U.S. attorney, Michael Chertoff learned how the mob operated.
They had the ability through the labor unions to stop a job, to delay a job, to make sure that the concrete was delivered in a manner that would be disruptive to the progress of the job. And they knew that by creating these kinds of problems, they could cost the companies millions of dollars.
Now we're talking here about hundreds of millions of dollars. We're talking about 4 families primarily: the Colombo family, the Genovese family, the Gambino family, and the Lucchese family. But the bosses of these 4 families had 6 general contractors, 6 construction companies that only these companies were allowed to bid on major projects in New York City. For every job that was over $2 million, the contractor that got the contract had to kick back to the families 2%.
The Lucchese leaders took the construction racket a step further than the other families.
The Lucchese family had one little specialty that everybody had overlooked, but they found it. They realized something. which is that if you're making construction-grade concrete, you need stone. Now, it turns out they discovered that almost all the stone comes from quarries in Connecticut. Well, they ship it by water, and it comes into Long Island. But there's only one port in Long Island that handles it and then processes it for construction purposes. Perfect scenario. They got control of the stone business.
The Luccheses also monopolized another small but vital union.
The Lucchese family got control of the plasters union. It's a small little union. Most people don't even know about it. And it was a union that represented the guys who go in with new construction. They go in and they have the little hods and the plaster. And they plaster up all the walls before the painters come in. Seems like a simple little thing, right? It's a lot of money.
Dominating construction, in effect imposed a tax on every resident of the city of New York, certainly in Manhattan, because there were millions of dollars in excess costs that were built into construction that were designed to produce money to be paid to mobsters. And so every single tenant, every single condo owner, everybody who lived in Manhattan was paying something that was eventually making its way to the mob.
The Luccheses lent new meaning to the old saying, one man's trash is another man's treasure. They gained control of the carting industry and hauled in millions.
The World Trade Center at one point, their garbage bill was $1.1 million a year. That's a lot of garbage, but not $1 million worth of garbage. What could the World Trade Center do? They found out there was only one garbage hauler which would pick up their garbage.
After World War II, Tommy Lucchese infiltrated the garbage hauling industry in the suburbs.
The carting industry on Long Island was an interesting industry. There was a trade association made up of the owners of the businesses. There was the union, which was controlled by the Gambino crime family. And then there were dump sites that were controlled by a variety of other individuals and entities. The Lucchese crime family was able to monopolize the industry and not just influence it, not just dominate it, but control it.
The Lucchese family also used the unions to profit from everything going in and out of New York's Kennedy Airport.
JFK Airport, if you look at the airport, it's very easily to see at the cargo aspect of it, tremendous amount of freight going through the airport. And the obvious priority for this freight is to be delivered in a timely fashion. How it gets delivered is by union carrier. So it just follows suit that the LCN saw a wonderful opportunity by controlling the local union.
Some business owners rebelled against the mob, but found themselves fighting a dangerous battle.
There was always the threat of violence. You know, we had tapes where mobsters would sit with contractors and tell them stories about people who had disappeared or people who had gotten beaten. And all this was designed to send a message that it could happen to you.
So let me get this straight. You guys want me to go with your carting company, even though it'll cost me 3 times as much as I was paying at my old location?
That would be the smart thing to do.
What if I say no? What if I don't want to use you guys? You can't force it.
Hey, it's a free country, pal. We ain't gonna make you do nothing you don't want to do.
That's right. This is a business decision that you gotta make. You familiar with Alden Supply Company? Yeah, they're across the street. That's right, Ken Strauss, the owner. What's he been missing for about a month now? One day he just didn't come home from work.
The problem was that Kenny made some bad business decisions.
They divvied up private businesses such as the carting business or concrete business for themselves. They ran their businesses contrary to the American way. They ran it their way. They enforced their control over businesses and industries.
For over 3 decades, Tommy Lucchese ran his criminal empire to great success without getting knocked off or imprisoned. He also successfully kept his personal family well insulated from his Mafia family. He died of natural causes, and after his death, his surviving relatives actually changed the spelling on his tombstone to keep outsiders away. Before he died, Lucchese had one last bit of underworld business to tend to, picking a successor to run the organization. His choice, with approval by the commission, was a protege from the old neighborhood in East Harlem, Anthony Corallo. Even more than his predecessor and mentor, Anthony Corallo's background was pure hoodlum, as former prosecutor Ronald Goldstock learned.
Corallo was an individual who came up through the family, through violence. People understood that. People were afraid of him. He was a person that was respected, and so for him to head the family was not surprising.
There was only one thing standing in the way of a smooth transition of power. Corallo was heading to a prison sentence on a bribery conviction, an unusual event for the mobster nicknamed Tony Ducks for his ability to duck the law.
Corallo was a person who believed in murder as a means of accomplishing their ends. He was an individual who grew up understanding what power meant and physical violence could do, and he practiced that from the time that he began criminal activities through his years as a labor racketeer into controlling the family.
Corallo began his Mafia career in the Lucchese family stronghold, the Garment District. By the 1950s, he was one of the biggest labor racketeers in the country. He and an associate allegedly put into power the most infamous union boss of all time, James Hoffa.
It is a complex area, and a lot of traditional organized crime groups really didn't know how to exploit it. Tony Ducks Corallo, Johnny Diaguardi did. Johnny Dio was the individual who created the paper locals in the Teamsters Union, which enabled Jimmy Hoffa to become the president. Tony Ducks Corallo played a menacing role within the area of labor racketeering.
Former FBI agent Jules Bonavolante was also familiar with Corallo.
I think if you go back to the McClellan hearings years ago, Senator McClellan himself said that Tony Ducks Corallo was one of the worst racketeers he'd ever seen. In fact, he said that either he or Robert Kennedy stated that Corallo had helped Jimmy Hoffa gain control of the union in New York.
The authorities were unable to prove Corallo's role in labor corruption. Instead, when he was convicted in the 60s, it was for bribery. The brief jail sentence only delayed Corallo's appointment as boss. The commission named an interim head, Carmine Tramunti, to run the family while Corallo served his time. After 23 months, Tony Ducks was out, assuming his position at the top of the Lucchese crime family. Under Corallo's reign as boss, the Lucchese family expanded operations in New York's Long Island. Corallo continued the family takeover of the suburban construction and garbage hauling industries, and appointed Sal Avellino as the family's point person in sanitation.
Well, Avellino's family had been in the Lucchese crime family. His father had been a soldier in the family. His father had interest in the carting industry. He took them over, and he was an extraordinarily good businessman. It was easy for him, I suppose, because he operated on the wrong side of the law, but he knew how to conduct his businesses, how to conduct the unions, how to conduct the trade association in a way in which would guarantee the mob the greatest amount of money.
With big earners such as Avellino under his command, Corallo was proving to be a worthy successor as boss of the Lucchese family. For a while, there seemed to be no end to the river of cash. Tony Ducks and his associates were already in the sights of the law, however. After the eye-opening testimony of Joseph Valachi, war on the Mafia became a top priority for law enforcement. And yet guys at the top like Corallo felt no fear. The authorities were learning that traditional methods of fighting crime had no long-lasting impact on the mob. For decades, gangsters operated with virtual impunity. On a local level, law enforcement was corrupt from top to bottom. At the national level, a limited war was fought by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, while the FBI, under the rule of J. Edgar Hoover, officially said there was no mob.
For a long time, until he was embarrassed into admitting the existence of organized crime. Mr. Hoover refused to admit even the existence of organized crime.
Various explanations for Hoover's position include persistent rumors of a secret personal life, and that the mob threatened to expose his lifestyle. For sure, Hoover was more interested in wars he could win for the benefit of the media. He was preoccupied with high-profile bank robbers and became obsessed with rooting out communists.
The Communist Party of the United States is a fifth column, if there ever was one. It is far better organized than were the Nazis in occupied countries prior to their capitulation. They are seeking to weaken America. Just as they did in their era of obstruction when they were aligned with the Nazis. Their goal is
charging a person with being a member of a mafia family was unheard of because of the difficulty the government would have in trying to prove that. They didn't have the inside witnesses. They didn't have the tape recordings of discussions between members of the mafia who would recite the names of the families or the leadership, who they might be, or the positions held by this guy and that guy. That came later.
Hard jail time was the furthest thing from the minds of the wise guys, but that too was about to change. After years of operating independently, local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies began cooperating. Ronald Goldstock headed the New York State Organized Crime Task Force in the 80s.
For a period of time, law enforcement had been fighting a war of attrition. Individuals were arrested and indicted for specific crimes. They may be put in prison. Generally, they were out after a relatively short period of time.
The FBI found it a frustrating experience.
We would find a witness. We would develop evidence about the crime. We would arrest the extortionists, and we put them in jail. No matter how many we arrested, as we like to say, there was always 100 in line to take their place.
One thing law enforcement knew was that often mob-related murders occurred with no witnesses, or with witnesses who were themselves mobsters and not likely to speak to the authorities. When a member of a gang was killed, it usually sent a message to the others to keep quiet.
That all changed with the RICO statute and electronic surveillance in 1968 and 1970, and other methods of dealing with problems of organized crime, where you could look at them as groups of individuals committing patterns of criminal activity.
Greg O'Connell and other prosecutors recognized the importance of the RICO statute.
The racketeering statute was a brilliant invention which enabled the government to charge not just a specific isolated offense of larceny or an arson or a payoff or a bribe or a murder in isolation, which is the way the country operated up until that time. What this offense allowed was the prosecution of an actual organization.
You really can't catch the leaders of organized crime on the streets. That's not where they are. Where they are is in social clubs or in restaurants, planning the activities that the soldiers and the captains are going to carry out.
We would plant mics in clubs, in bars, in restaurants, in homes, in different rooms. We would book telephones, all by court order.
One of the things we were looking to do was to use the RICO statute to indict the commission, the heads of the 5 New York crime families. The Organized Crime Task Force had extraordinary information as to the Lucchese family and some evidence as to the heads of 1 or 2 others. The FBI had bugs in on the heads of 3 families at the time. And so if you combine the two, there was a mountain of evidence that could be used to indict and convict all of the family bosses.
The New York City Police Department and the FBI began working together with a common goal. Rich Sita was a New York detective on mob duty.
At this point, a marriage was made, if you will, between the FBI and the New York City Police Department Organized Crime Investigation Division, where a commitment of detectives were assigned to FBI squads. And those squads were dedicated to investigations, proactive investigations into organized crime families in the New York City area.
I personally don't believe we could have done the job that we did without the help and assistance of the New York City Police Department. They had an ability to do things from their days on the street as cops and their experience that we could not do. We as agents could not do. We complemented each other beautifully, and it couldn't have been a better match. And without them, as I say, we would have never succeeded as well as we did.
One of the most significant achievements of the joint effort was the planting of a bug in the Jaguar belonging to Lucchese capo Sal Avellino. Investigators learned that Tony Ducks routinely rode with Avellino to discuss Mafia business.
Why we only got 150 trucks running when we used to have 300 trucks running, so.
They got half of that on the other side, Tony. I mean, come on, we're doing the best we can. Busting my chops here.
Yeah, well, this is our bread and butter, you know that. I want to keep it that way. This is the business that brings in most of the money.
They knew the car would be the key to their investigation. But planting a bug in the mobile Lucchese headquarters was not going to be easy. The car was constantly garaged at Sal Avellino's home. When parked away from home, it was never left unattended. And when being driven, Avellino drove deliberately circuitous routes to throw off any would-be tails. Members of the task force waited for the right moment. Meanwhile, the team practiced the bugging procedure, working with an identical car and hoping for a break.
In under 15. Ready? Go!
That opportunity presented itself one rainy March night when Avellino drove to a catering hall in Long Island for a garbage industry function. Avellino turned the Jaguar over to two of his hoods, whose job it was to stand watch over the car while their boss was inside. Meanwhile, the team of bugging experts were watching from the far end of the parking lot. With rain pouring down on them, the two guards finally decided it was safe to leave the car briefly and ducked inside the hall. That's when the task force men made their move. They scaled the fence and dashed towards Avellino's car. In one motion, they opened the door and went to work on the dashboard, while one of the team kept watch with a walkie-talkie in back in case anyone approached the car. Within minutes, they had planted the bug. And just as quickly as they got in, the team exited the car and closed the doors, being careful not to leave any telltale drops of water inside. When Avellino left the catering hall later, his two bodyguards helped him into the car, none of them suspecting even remotely that the Jaguar had been tampered with. The bug immediately began yielding some of the most useful surveillance audio ever. Investigators knew that the majority of mob bosses did not pass on the business to their own sons, most preferring to keep their real family separate from their mafia family. They also knew the commission officially forbade heroin dealing. The bosses felt that stiff drug sentences would tempt those arrested to turn and testify against the mafia. Conversations recorded in the JAG confirmed those findings. Here, Tony Ducks and Avellino can be heard discussing the merits of inducting their sons into the mafia.
Andy Russo just made his other son, the eldest one. Wait. I guess on the last, recently, I don't know when, I mean, you know, in the last year. Yeah. He made his two sons.
So they'll make you good?
No, not now. I mean, not my thinking right now is no. Might change 5 years from now, 10 years from now, but right now my thinking is no. You were talking about that the other day with
I didn't know what it was.
Tree Court. And their feeling is that if this life was good enough for them, why isn't it good enough for their son?
Who said that?
Well, They gotta be feeling that way. They gotta think that way. Tom said no. Tom said he would never, if he had a son, he would never say, Tom feels like you feel. Tom says, no, I would never make my son. Okay? As long as you live it. What happens if your kid knows all these types of people? This scum, and you get to your kid like he's in the union and stuff, and he knows all these people, what would you do? Like he gets involved here, he gets involved there. No, they're not crooked, you know? What happens to some of these fucking shit eaters think they got, that they figure they got something coming? Or they're going to annoy him, or they you know, there's that type of people. You know? I'm just talking out loud, like.
And here, Corralo was blunt about what to do with Mafia members found selling heroin.
The original objective of the investigation was to capture evidence, collect as much evidence about the carting industry. Well, what do you know? They caught conversations of the boss of the Lucchese crime family speaking about a variety of crime family interests, including the concrete case. And those tapes were the foundation for what was later known as the Commission case.
This was the effort by the U.S. Attorney's Office to bring down the heads of all the New York crime families. Michael Chertoff was the lead prosecutor.
What the case did was we essentially proved the activities of the Commission over a 50-year period. We had evidence about the famous 1957 meeting of the bosses in Appalachia, New York. We had evidence of other Commission meetings. And we actually demonstrated members of the Commission engaged in dividing up the proceeds of extortion in the construction industry in the city of Manhattan. Bosses and their lieutenants sitting down and talking about how to cut up the money that they were receiving from concrete companies that were paying off on every contract that they engaged in Manhattan. Basically what the Commission did was divide up every contract involving the pouring of concrete that was over $2 million in value among the four families. The Banana family was cut out of that conspiracy. And every job would result in a payment of 2% of the contract price to the bosses, who we then divided them up among the various families as their share of this extortion operation. We also proved that the Commission had authorized the murder of Carmen Galante, who was the boss of the Banana family in 1979, and we did that in the old-fashioned way. We used fingerprint evidence, we used eyewitness evidence, and we used circumstantial evidence from videotapes and photographs. And with that evidence, the wiretaps, the physical evidence, the fingerprints, we were able to put together a picture of the activities of the Commission really going back to the early 1930s.
When the case ended, the top ranks of the New York Mafia were off to prison. Tony Ducks was sent away for the rest of his life. It was a milestone in the war against organized crime.
All of us who worked on the case knew it was going to be a legendary case. This was the top echelon of the Mafia. For the first time, we were going to prove the existence of a commission, that there was a nationwide syndicate. We were going to prove events that had occurred 30, 40, 50 years ago that one had read about but that had never actually been established in court. We knew that to take down the bosses, who were long viewed as the most secretive and the most hidden and the most powerful members of organized crime, would be a devastating blow. And at the end of the case, when every single defendant was convicted on every single count, I think we felt we'd achieved a victory that was really remarkable.
Subsequent to his conviction, along with other top mobsters, Tony Ducks Corralo was handed a 100-year prison sentence. His 2-decade term as boss of the family was finished. When he turned over the reins of power to Vic Amuso, Corralo probably didn't know that he was indirectly contributing to the downfall of his own crime family, and to a certain extent the entire New York Mafia. Former Assistant U.S. Attorney Greg O'Connell believes the assumption of leadership by Amuso and his chief aide Anthony Gaspipe Casso was a major turning point.
I think that once Tony Ducks Corralo picked Vic Amuso to run the family, along with Gaspipe, that was the death knell of the Lucchese crime family. It was a reign of terror in the Lucchese crime family, where treachery ruled supreme in that family, and where the treachery that was orchestrated by Amuso and Casso enabled that family.
One event that led to trouble for the Lucchese family was when the new family leaders went into a window replacement racket with the Genovese family through a mutual associate, Peter Savino.
What happened was Peter Savino, as a Genovese associate, who was directly associated with a guy named Jerry Papa, who was then a soldier in the Genovese crime family, were looking for a business to enter, not just any business, but some profitable business that they might know something about, and they were experienced in construction. And Peter Savino had met someone who was involved in the window replacement business and thought that might be a lucrative industry for him to enter.
In the 70s, we all experienced the oil shortage and the dramatic rise in pricing in fuel oil and gasoline. And it became readily apparent that it was cost effective to replace windows in your home and in businesses to offset the price of heating. The New York City Housing Authority, if you looked at New York City, you saw the number of housing projects, housing developments that they had a tremendous amount of windows and a tremendous amount of money that they were pouring into heating.
As a part of a program to better insulate the buildings and reduce energy costs. So these many buildings in New York City and elsewhere in the country didn't have thermopane windows. They had windows that had been there for 40 years that let a whole lot of heat out and a whole lot of cold in.
It didn't take the LCN very long to figure out an angle, and the angle was to have selective installers bid rig, get the bid, and then assess them a price of $2 per window for labor piece. If you multiplied the number of housing developments by the number of windows in place that have been replaced, you can see the significance of this windows case.
While Vic Amuso and Tony Casso waited for profits to pour in from the window racket, the law began to catch up with them. A murder investigation led authorities to victims buried under Peter Savino's factory.
Upon digging up those bodies, as we were standing there watching this evidence come to us, we realized that we had what we needed to roll and to confront and roll yet another very influential and knowledgeable person in the Genovese family, and that was Peter Savino. And he ran around for 18 months, wired up in a secret undercover investigation against numerous members and captains and underboss and consiglieres of various crime families, until finally we pulled the plug.
The windows case was successfully prosecuted through a cooperating witness, Peter Savino. He had the inside knowledge, if you will, of the machinations that occurred that allowed this case to proceed. How the bids were rigged, how the payments were extorted and distributed.
When we indicted the windows case, Vic Amuso and Anthony Gaspipe Casso, who were then the boss and underboss, the two highest ranking members of the Lucchese crime family, fled. And while they were on the lam, they began a series of contracts on their own leadership, which we later prosecuted Vic Amuso for and Gaspipe Casso. They knocked off captains who they thought might be treacherous. They labeled them as rats and ordered their own soldiers to kill their own. And it happened half a dozen times.
The murderous actions of Gaspipe Casso led authorities to believe he was either insane or just plain stupid.
Stupid to a degree that is almost breathtaking. It is almost inconceivable that in an organization originally founded by a guy who was so low-key, you would never guess this man was a mafia leader, to be replaced ultimately by a psychopath.
Amuso and Casso became increasingly paranoid. They even turned on their own chief executioner, Peter Chiodo, when he failed to carry out a hit. After an attempt was made on his life, Chiodo flipped and became a witness. So did acting underboss, Little Al D'Arco. In 1993, D'Arco walked into the FBI's office in White Plains, New York, after being falsely labeled a rat.
I don't want to be chasing down your leads.
It was an event law enforcement was waiting for in their ongoing war against one of the world's most successful criminal dynasties ever.
This is it. Let's hear it.
Okay. I'm going to tell you what I know, and I'm going to tell you how I know it.
For the Lucchese family, the curtain was closing. Prosecutors were able once again to strip away the top layers of the family leadership.
Vic and Musa is still the boss of the Lucchese crime family. And that's what I think the government's view of the situation, based on the evidence, their current understanding, is that he hasn't relinquished control. But he could.
Former FBI agent Bonavolante believes the Lucchese family is in serious trouble.
The new leaders, the leaders of today, the second and third team, as I have always called them, they're tied not by honor, respect, and family. They're tied by the economy. They're tied by money. They're tied by greed. And greed and money, those ties are much easier to break than honor, respect, and family. So what we're finding is a much less competent Mafia leader today, La Cosa Nostra leader today, than we had in the 70s and 80s.
You know, you ever see those charts? And, you know, the original Neanderthal or the Lucy, wherever it is, the earliest man, they look sort of ape-like. But as the time goes on, they get smarter, their brain cases get bigger, and now they're erect Homo sapiens in business suits. It's the opposite way here. Turn it around. We start from criminal genius over here to caveman on this side. There's a reverse descent going on.
One of the most distinguishing, albeit regrettable, characteristics of the 20th century in America has been the proliferation of organized crime. From the Tommy gun-wielding gangsters of the Roaring '20s to the all-powerful dons of the Godfather era, to the silent and insidious control the Mafia had over everyday life in the 60s and 70s. In just the last decade and a half, though, law enforcement has finally been able to make some real headway in their ongoing battle. Though Thomas Dewey promised to rid the country of the mob, and Robert Kennedy made the same promise decades later, it has only been in recent years that new laws and new approaches to fighting organized crime have started to pay off. Federal, state, and local police have finally figured out how to work together effectively. Legislators have at last given prosecutors laws with teeth. The once powerful dynasty that was the Lucchese family has also been affected by cultural changes since the early 1900s. Old world traditions transplanted in the land of opportunity provided just the fertile conditions needed to produce such criminal masterminds as Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Gaetano Lucchese. Later replacements for the founders of the National Crime Syndicate seem to have taken a Darwinian step backward.
You know, the leaders all went to jail for 100 years. They were replaced by people who were somewhat less experienced, somewhat less tested. And then in all the subsequent cases that were made, that group of leaders was taken out and sent to jail. And what we have now is a leadership of the mob that is, I think, really only a shadow of what it was 10 years ago. They're less experienced, they're less sophisticated, they're less skillful at organizing, and really they're more glorified street thugs than the kind of sophisticated organized crime businessmen you had in the early and mid-'80s. And the turnover has become more rapid and they haven't matured as leaders. But also, when the mob realized that the government was effectively targeting bosses, all of a sudden some of the brightest people in the mob didn't want to be bosses anymore. And you started to hear that they were having difficulty, you know, finding the top captains to take the promotions. The big earners, the really shrewd criminal operators wanted to keep a lower profile. They didn't want to be promoted. And I think that has had a long-term impact on the effectiveness of the mob.
Ethnic succession has also worn away at Mafia families such as the Lucchese's, for so long dominated by Sicilians. New arrivals, new minorities have tried to pick up the slack and fill criminal niches left vacant by the old mob.
If people think the battle is over, if they walk away from the constant need to fight organized crime, then in 10 years or 20 years, organized crime will come back.
Though many have proclaimed the death of the old mob, especially the dynasty once ruled by Tommy Lucchese, law enforcement officers caution that the Mafia is down